Caribe Radio nos proponemos ser la emisora online calificada para ser la mejor opción en comunicación para usted. Nos preparamos en noticias, deportes, cultura, música y de entretenimiento general para que usted esté conectado todo el tiempo con nosotros. Caribe Radio ofrece el mejor servicio de comunicación digital para que las empresas se hagan visibles a diferentes públicos. Desde lo público trabajamos para el servicio y por el servicio social. Caribe Radio Online nos entrenamos día a día para brindar la mejor opción en producción de medios digitales. Caribe Radio, la radio del futuro.
Los conceptos, productos y servicios del siguiente espacio son responsabilidad del director del programa y no representan el pensamiento de esta emisora.
Good afternoon. This is Conversations with Authors, part of Books Over Drinks. We're a literary community dedicated to foster a passion for books and provide a platform for both authors and readers to exchange ideas and discuss their work. We are pleased to welcome Dr. Dan Werb. He's an epidemiologist and a policy analyst and with expertise working in the fields of HIV, addictions, and drug policy. He's also an assistant professor in the Department of Medicine, Divisions of Infectious Diseases and Global Public Health at UC San Diego. And he joins us today to discuss his book on the history of the rise of coronaviruses, The Invisible Siege. This is a fascinating book that covers decades worth of scientific discovery in the pursuit of uncovering the mechanics of these coronaviruses and ways to prepare for future threats. The book is divided into three parts, all covering the history and lessons learned from past encounters with these type of viruses. The first one covers SARS, the SARS epidemic in 2003. The second one, the MERS epidemic in 2012. And the third part covers the most recent COVID-2 epidemic in 2019, outlining the building blocks for the technological and scientific achievements that made it possible to effectively address, all things considered, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic from testing, vaccines, and therapeutics. The book stays true to the facts and limits itself to the history of human ingenuity and the pursuit to understanding the Coronaviridae, a family of RNA viruses from its more innocuous origins to the more pathogenic strains. So, Dr. Werb, it is a pleasure having you with us. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, happy to be here.
Awesome. So I will certainly not ask you to turn this into a lecture, but I did want to start setting the context for the audience by asking you to help us understand, in layman's terms, of course, what a coronavirus actually is.
Yeah, sure. So, and I think it's important to note, like you described in the intro there, the focus of my research work, and I'm an epidemiologist, but before the COVID-19 pandemic, I knew absolutely nothing about the coronavirus family, which they call the Coronaviridae, or, the internal kind of detailed sort of virological questions that drive a lot of this book. So, in terms of putting it in layman's terms, like I felt like a layman going in, which I think is probably helpful when you're trying to write a book for a general audience. So, yeah, I mean, when we're talking about coronaviruses, this is a family of really special RNA viruses. So RNA viruses use RNA, which is a single helix genome, to store their information and replicate. That's compared to all other sort of like true animals and organisms, which use DNA, right? The double helix, which we're all familiar with, stores all of our genetic information and uses what we use to replicate. So I say coronaviruses are special. That's because RNA is this really kind of fragile and really sort of like easily destroyed substance. So it's kind of like the cheaper version of DNA in a way, right? Like you can store a lot of information in it to a point. And if it gets too big, when viruses that use RNA replicate, they just have tons and tons of mutations because it's not as complicated as DNA, it can't kind of smooth out mutations and errors when these viruses are replicated. And so for a long time, everyone thought that viruses that used RNA could only have genetic material that spanned about 10,000 bases, right? So really not a lot of information. Now, coronaviruses, though, have 30,000 bases. So they're 3 times as big as other RNA viruses. And as one of the virologists in the book that I wrote said, theoretically, they shouldn't exist on planet Earth. Like they're this total anomaly. And, I think that's what makes them special. And while that sounds like a really kind of detailed niche attribute, that attribute is actually one of the key ways that humans have found a way to counteract these viruses, which is pretty cool, and which I get into in the book.
Absolutely. And I thought it was fascinating, the fact that just, what is it, like 2 decades ago, it was really an understudied field, the whole topic of coronaviruses. The one thing that I thought it was interesting is that, and what I wanted to ask you is, why are certain animals like bats, or in the case of MERS, camels, natural reservoirs of these viruses?
That's a great question. I mean, I don't know if I could tell you in terms of like the specific mechanics, but I can tell you that some animals, especially social animals, are better reservoirs of viruses because they cohabitate and they can pass all of these strains across all of their individuals. So like, there's bat colonies that have been found in Texas, for instance, where there's like 25 million bats living in one sort of rookery, one what they call them hibernaculum. So that means that there's like all of these bats in close quarters, and they're just constantly transmitting these viruses in amongst their members, right? So they're just spending generations upon generations of bats that are moving coronaviruses across, and what that allows coronaviruses to do is just constantly be mutating and replicating and changing and creating new variants. In the case of camels, right, which you described, so you were talking about the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, or MERS epidemic that emerged in 2012. So that was first detected in Saudi Arabia. And eventually, and this is one of the favorite parts of the book for me, was writing this part about kind of tracking the MERS epidemic in Saudi Arabia. And you've got this really oppressive government that doesn't want to release any information about it. You've got epidemiologists that are trying to get into the country to understand how this virus, which kills 50% of the people that it infects, is moving, and what it even actually is. And eventually, you learn that camels are implicated. So why camels? Really similar reason. They were herded together. And in Saudi Arabia and some other countries, Arab countries, they're farmed and basically butchered. They're moved together into abattoirs and into holding pens. And when you've got all of these animals in close quarters, I mean, we've experienced this as humans ourselves with this COVID-19 pandemic. You put human beings together, if one person is infected with the virus, it's going to spread to absolutely everybody else, or many, many other people. And that's what they found with camels as well for MERS. So, it's so much of this is about social animals being better at kind of transmitting and being more useful hosts for these viruses. And bats are an amazing example because they're very social animals. Camels, of course, and unfortunately, humans.
Yeah. Now, in your book, you mentioned that the extent to which SARS had become contained in 2003 made the world sort of underestimate these viruses, and made us, in your book, you say, learn the wrong lessons, like the misconception that the coronaviruses are slow-moving viruses and largely innocuous. Do you think downplaying the threat of Coronaviridae after SARS impacted our ability to tackle MERS? And did we learn the lesson by the time SARS-CoV-2 appeared?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and I think humanity worldwide did not learn the right lessons, just as you're saying. So SARS 2002, almost 10,000 people get infected worldwide, right? It's not quite a pandemic, but it's an epidemic in many different countries. And eventually SARS, because it wasn't efficient, like it didn't move between people and infect different people very effectively. It was contained and ultimately driven out of human populations just through public health restrictions, which is incredible. Now, this was a virus that killed 10% of the people that it infected. So really, really dangerous virus. But it was also a virus that was most infectious at the time when people had the most symptoms. So, that's different than SARS-2, which is the virus we're dealing with now. With SARS-2, people are most infectious generally right before they become asymptomatic and maybe in the early days of being symptomatic. So that means that, everybody can be a carrier without knowing it, and that allows the virus to proliferate across human species. SARS-1, as I said, you were feeling horrible. When you were the most sick, you were also the most infectious. So that made it really easy for public health authorities to just isolate people. And, people were self-isolating when they got really sick. And that had, kind of a chain reaction that allowed the virus to not spread super far. The flip side, though, is, SARS was the first pathogenic coronavirus that we had encountered in the modern era. And up until that point, there were these other two human infecting coronaviruses that just caused common colds. As you said, everyone thought that they were innocuous, that they were they didn't mutate very rapidly, that they didn't have this innate ability to jump between species very much. And SARS totally blew that out of the water. Now, most people just thought, oh, there was this crazy epidemic that happened once in a lifetime, that's never going to happen again. Of course, there were like a handful of coronavirus experts at the time that thought, holy shit, I mean, we've been studying this family of viruses for decades, because lots of people started studying it in the 1980s. And suddenly we've discovered that basically something that we've always just studied in the lab has busted out into the real world. And that was, in the words of Ralph Barrick, who's one of the main characters in the book and someone who'd been studying, I would say probably he's one of the most consequential scientists right now because of his work on coronaviruses and how that impacted COVID-19. But at the time he said, he described it as being a shock, but not a surprise. So he knew that coronaviruses had this capacity to jump between species, but actually seeing that play out in the real world was surprising and terrifying.
Now, speaking about the scientific breakthroughs that came as a result of our fight against, especially COVID-19, your book covers major milestones and scientific achievements without which we wouldn't have been able to mitigate the threats of coronaviruses, from Malik Paris's discovery of SARS, to the mapping of the genetic makeup of SARS, to the development of PCR testing, to the development of mRNA technology that is the basis for the COVID-19 vaccines we have today. After all of these, do you think that we now have an effective framework to deal with future pandemics and rapidly respond with gene mapping, testing, and the development of vaccines and therapeutics?
Yeah, so I kind of didn't answer your last question, which was, did we learn the right lessons? So broadly, no, we didn't learn the right lessons, but luckily as a species, right, we didn't learn the right lessons, which, the right lesson would have been, this family is a threat. What we kind of collectively learned was, oh, when this family emerges as a threat, we can deal with it. It's not ever going to get that dangerous. But luckily, there was this small band of coronavirologists and other people working on the technologies that you're describing and had been working on them basically since even before SARS. So now, in the wake of what's happened with this pandemic, I actually have a lot of hope for the future. So I do think that the things that you've described, like, understanding how these viruses move, public health restrictions and kind of public health interventions and how to impose them. The vaccines and the vaccine technologies, like mRNA vaccine technologies, are so adaptable and flexible and have been shown to be safe, which is incredible, and efficacious and effective. And then we have this growing number of antivirals and other therapeutics so that, even when people do get sick, we can make sure that they don't get really, really sick and die. So, we do have an amazing framework. That's, of course, you have to balance that optimism and hope with the fact that, okay, we've now seen 3 novel coronaviruses, SARS, MERS, SARS-2, in the span of 20 years, spill over into human populations and do some serious damage. So, like, this is now a trend, right? Like, we're not talking about one-offs. We're not talking about, oh, lightning struck twice or 3 times. Like, this is a trend where we're seeing this family of viruses, obviously, having the potential and the opportunities to intersect with human beings more frequently. And I think that means that there is inevitably going to be another coronavirus that breaks through. That doesn't mean, though, necessarily another pandemic, because again, if we can impose all of these sort of technologies and tools that we've discovered and learned about and honed with this pandemic, we can make sure that an outbreak of a novel pathogen, a novel coronavirus, stays as an outbreak and doesn't, proliferate and metastasize into an epidemic and a pandemic.
That's extremely interesting. We've, at least in the US, we've returned to some sense of like normalcy. Yet in places like mainland China, we're reading about outbreaks which in their case have been attributed to more contagious Omicron subvariant. But like you were saying, I read an article where Bill Gates, for example, mentioned that while people are tired of COVID, and which we all are, he warned that difficult days may be ahead of us. So it is important, I guess, what you were mentioning about not downplaying what it now seems to be a trend for the past 2 decades. Go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, I think what I discovered right in this book is that in the past 20 years, so since basically the beginning of the 21st century, we've seen more novel pathogens spill over and have the threat of becoming pandemics than over the entirety of the 20th century. So like, we're seeing this acceleration of our intersection with viruses and other pathogens that can be dangerous to us. That's a bad thing, right? Obviously. And that's tempered with the technologies that were being developed. So I think on balance, we're better prepared for these new threats technologically. There are going to be more threats. And the question, I think, is basically, how can you distribute the gains, the scientific and medical gains that have been made across the entire globe, right? Because who knows where the next coronavirus or whatever pathogen is going to emerge. If it emerges in somewhere that's not equipped to, again, like contain an outbreak, that's going to be dangerous for the entire world. So that's where this question of kind of like equity, people hate hearing about equity, about, oh, we need to get vaccines to everywhere in the world. Like, I think people think of that as like an abstract suggestion and kind of just like people banging the drum of sort of like morality. But actually, it's the most selfish thing we can do. If we want to protect ourselves, we need to make sure that everybody shares in the gains of the scientific discoveries that have been made.
Absolutely. And there is one additional point related to that, which is not just making sure that those locations or those places are fully equipped to deal with pandemics, but also have transparency across the board, which is something as well that I learned from your book, which was fascinating, in the lack of international cooperation in the wake, international cooperation, for example, cooperation in the wake of the SARS and MERS epidemics. For example, Saudi Arabia's and China's hermetism back in 2012 and 2019, respectively, which kept the scientific community in the dark in the early days of when the virus first appeared, and wasting in a way precious time. and how markets, for example, were kept open in Wuhan long after the first case, mostly due to pressures of a billion-dollar industry. So how important is international cooperation in dealing with these type of viruses and epidemics?
Yeah, I mean, it's hugely important. And I think beyond that, one of the things that I learned, and there's one really interesting guy that I cover or that I follow in the book, this epidemiologist and virologist named Ian Lipkin, who is a Columbia University professor. He was the scientific advisor on contagion, and somebody who thinks really deeply about how epidemics spread and kind of how culturally they can affect cultures and societies at large. And he was on the ground with SARS, he was on the ground with MERS, and of course he was responding to COVID-19. And his approach to dealing with epidemics is to look at governments, right? And to really consider governments as sort of these variables that are always kind of contributing to epidemics, right? And I think the reason is, you look at, again, China at the beginning of this pandemic, Saudi Arabia at the beginning of, during the 2012 MERS epidemic. Like, these are governments that are interested in protecting themselves and protecting their authority, and they do so at their own peril. And they do so, these sort of short-term gains that they're trying to make by refusing to share information always ends up biting them in the ass. And like, we see this unfortunately with China now. Like, the Chinese government has been really incredible in a lot of ways in terms of exporting information about COVID-19. And it was Chinese scientists that first mapped and released the genetic code for the SARS-CoV-2 virus that causes COVID-19. And like, there's been a lot of data sharing, but that's tempered with the fact that there's been a lot of just complete lack of information sharing, right? So there was this WHO China joint mission to find the origins of the SARS virus, SARS-2 virus, which I cover in the book. And like, it ultimately ended up getting bogged down in Chinese refusal to share information. And so what does that do? That just creates mistrust on all sides and makes it harder for anyone to get answers.
Fascinating. Now, the vaccines were developed very fast, but it took some time and some effort to do so, which is contradictory. But it was fascinating to learn that Moderna, for example, had a working vaccine by January 2020, and yet it was not until December that it was under the emergency use authorization that it was approved for use. And despite taking over a year to be released to the public, this was considered a really expeditious process. So what goes into taking a vaccine like this into the market? And is there anything that could be done to expedite it more? Or you think that this is really as fast as we can get it out?
So I think what I found even more interesting doing this research for the book is that Moderna, like the COVID vaccine that Moderna produced, was not their first coronavirus vaccine. They had previously worked with the National Institutes of Health in the States, Fauci's National Institute for Allergy and Infectious Medicine, or Infectious Disease, to produce a vaccine candidate for MERS, this 2012 coronavirus. So they had been funded earlier on to basically, run through their paces and identify a potential threat or, a family of viruses that could cause potential further threats to humans, landed on coronaviruses, landed on MERS as a virus to start vaccinating against, not really in and of itself, like for any market gain, but the NIH was interested in doing this to kind of prepare for the future, right? And it is lucky that they did. Like, a huge reason that Moderna was able to get their vaccine into clinical trials, as you said, they had a vaccine candidate by January 2020. They basically had it in clinical trials, I think, by March or maybe even earlier of 2020. A huge reason for that is that they already had on the shelf this other coronavirus mRNA vaccine. So it in a way, Operation Warp Speed, it's like, yeah, Trump let the funding hose, open. It was like a fire hose, and then all of a sudden there were vaccines. But the reality is that these technologies were years in the making, and I think in a lot of ways, what allowed them to get to market so quickly, yeah, the funding was helpful, but more to the point, it was, I think, the removal of a lot of the barriers that slow down research and the process of research. Like, there's all these guardrails to make sure that everything is safe and effective and no one's going to get hurt by vaccines. Now, those pieces weren't removed, but more resources were put into that, so that all of the kind of checkpoints to make sure that vaccines were effective could be moved through more quickly, for the obviously in the interest of saving people's lives. So it's a funny, as you say, like like they both came quickly, but they were years and years in the making. And I think, there's a lot of people still that are hesitant about taking vaccines. I would say reading this book, you get a better sense of the long process by which these technologies were developed, and that it wasn't just, someone had this zany idea, it was untested, and then suddenly within months it was being jabbed into people's arms. Like, the story is a much longer one, and it's one of the most consequential scientific discoveries of our age are these mRNA vaccines.
Fascinating. To dive deeper into that, one of the things that I loved about your book is that is the people behind these scientific achievements, all of who seem to share a common altruistic view towards the pursuit of a common good. And your book does not limit itself to just talk about the science, but also, or the professional backgrounds, but also their personalities, their personal views, their personal drives, and their motivations. How do you achieve these as part of this creative process of writing the book?
Well, I mean, I'm interested in people, right? So like I do scientific research, and when I'm writing for a general audience, like, I'm not interested in just regurgitating scientific research and, for people. Like, I'm interested in people, I'm interested in the stories, I'm interested in people's motivations and, the challenges that they face, not as like brilliant scientists, but just as someone like you or me. So I think the challenge for me in writing the book was that early on, as I said, I'm an epidemiologist, I'm a social epidemiologist. So I understand sort of the impact and how epidemics can shape people through their behaviors and through the kind of policies and structures that they encounter in their lives. But I didn't know anything really about virology. So early on, I'm interviewing all these virologists, and it was like learning a new language. Like, I would have conversations with these scientists, I would understand maybe 20% of what they were talking to me about. When the interview was over, I'd be kind of white knuckling it through these interviews. I would read the transcripts, and then I would dig into, hundreds and hundreds of peer-reviewed research that I have some facility reading from my scientific training. And then it became this process of translation, right? Like, I was learning this new language. I had this capacity to read the kind of research that they had been referring to and the concepts they'd been referring to. And then I go back to the interviews, the transcripts, and I'm like, now I see what they were talking about. So over time, you go back to the same people, the same scientists, and like, if it was 20% that I understood the first interview, then it was 40%, then 60%, then 80%, then, on and on and on. So it was like immersing myself in this new language. And then the book was like writing translation, right? Like, I was taking this kind of strange language of virology and structural biology of viruses and turning it into something that I could understand and a reader could grasp. And then, taking that and understanding how all of those pieces sort of emerged out of people's own motivations as human beings. Like, that's what was fun for me.
And it was definitely well written. The storytelling aspects of the book were definitely on point. I wanted to ask you something that was interesting to sort of finalize or close out the interview. When when I first got to your book and I started reading about you, I found an article in the San Diego Union Tribune, which was speaking about 3 Dan works that you could find whenever you Google your name. One was a musician who plays for a band called the Woodhands. Another one was a writer and a journalist who wrote a book about the effects of the Mexican drug trade, heading women in Tijuana, and yours, and this book, The Invisible Siege. And it was fascinating to learn that they were all talking about the same person.
Yeah.
That it was you. So can you tell us a little bit about your previous book and of course about your music as well?
Yeah. So I mean, I started researching so as I said, I am a social epidemiologist, and I started researching issues around substance use in Vancouver, which is where I'm from originally, in Vancouver, in Canada. And it was just a summer job at first. Like, I would crank out manuscripts, I would write, help my supervisors sort of write stuff that they could, turn into scientific peer-reviewed papers. It was a great job because I could do it remotely. And back then remote work was much harder. This is like, decade pre-pandemic, if probably longer. And the reason it was so great is because I was a touring musician. So I would be playing shows at night with my band Woodhands, which is like an electro dance band, and then just in our tour van, like during the day, writing scientific manuscripts. And so through that work, I ended up in San Diego and doing research on the effects of the drug war and cartels and border policies on women who were involved in the sex trade in Tijuana. So, it was a really interesting experience for me because there's this epidemic, truly an epidemic of femicide, right? So it was, it's a scene where, situation where women are dying, women are being killed by cartel members, through intimate partner violence, and just in many different ways, as a result of the vulnerabilities they experience within this sex trade in Tijuana, in the shadow of the border wall. And so much of their lives, I wanted to try to explain to readers or kind of show for readers that it went beyond just the circumstances of one woman's life, that it truly was an epidemic. And so I took my epidemiologic lens. I had been doing research there, and I basically translated that into this book, City of Omens, a search for the missing women of the borderlands. And it was a hard book to write, right? Because it's so different from The Invisible Siege. It's all about one place, one city, and it's really about tracking just the vulnerabilities and what transformed that city into such a dangerous place for women. I'm sure familiar with Roberto Bolaño's 2666, and there's work, another book by a Mexican writer called The Femicide Machine. And these were books that, I found going into writing City of Omens. It was like the best descriptions of what women experienced on the border, like I found in 2666, this amazing Bolaño book, which was fictionalized, but more real than anything I had ever read. So, that was kind of where the motivation for that book came. And then, as the pandemic started, one of the real motivations to write The Invisible Siege originally came from the fact that, like everybody, I was anxious. I didn't know what was going to happen. This was a new phenomenon. You can understand things about epidemics in theoretical and conceptual ways. It's totally different than experiencing them in real life. So early on, I was trying to understand, okay, like how should I understand where this pandemic or this epidemic is emerging, and how can I kind of put boundaries on my anxiety? And so I went back to this concept that I also explored a little bit in my earlier book, City of Omens, which is the epidemic triangle. And it's this concept that anybody can understand. It states that all epidemics arise from a shift in the relationship between a pathogen, their host, and the environment within which the host and the pathogen interact. And so, just like, it's a really simple concept, but like so many simple concepts, it's so elegant. And that is a frame that I basically use to explore how this current pandemic emerged. And, by using that framework of this epidemic triangle, that's what led me to MERS. That's what led me to SARS. That's what led me to all these amazing scientists who had been tracking this family of viruses for so long. And that's how I was able to kind of build off of the work that I already done.
And this is indeed a fascinating book that gives a history of human ingenuity in the pursuit of the battle and to battle the threats of coronaviruses and of viruses in general. The book is called The Invisible Siege, the Rise of Coronaviruses and the Search for a Cure. It is written by Dr. Dan Ware. Dan, it was a pleasure having you with us today. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to having you back, especially to talk about your previous book.
Yeah, thanks so much, Ira. I really appreciate it.
Caribe Radio, nos proponemos ser la emisora online calificada para ser la mejor opción en comunicación para usted. Nos preparamos en noticias, deportes, cultura, música y de entretenimiento general para que usted esté conectado todo el tiempo con nosotros. Caribe Radio ofrece el mejor servicio de comunicación digital para que las empresas se hagan visibles a diferentes públicos. Desde lo público trabajamos para el servicio y por el servicio social. Caribe Radio Online nos entrenamos día a día para brindar la mejor opción en producción de medios digitales. Caribe Radio, la radio del futuro.